Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be a part of this. And I've been following the club like off and on now for some time, checking the website occasionally, because it just is a nice model of how this research will happen going forward, of communicating and collaborating across people from different backgrounds. So, I'm gonna I have a presentation here, and there'll be a couple points where I can stop and make sure that we're all on the same page. And so if you want to put questions into the chat, then I can like open up the chat window in the middle of the talk and see. Um, and then also that will give us things to talk about towards the end. So let me get started. And I think some of this will be more familiar than others. And so that's why the chat is so important for getting into it. So I'm titling this talk Sharing Files with Strangers: How Amateurs Made the Internet Social. And a couple of the key terms there are strangers and amateurs. In strangers, it's because we take for granted now that going online is about meeting people that you don't know. But this is one of the very odd things about this form of social interaction, that you would communicate with total strangers through your computer screen. So one of the key questions is why? Why has it come to be accepted as normal behavior for people to spend hours sitting in front of their computers talking to people that they've never met before? Now, in my teaching, every year for the last 4 years or so, I've asked my students in my internet history class a series of questions. And the two questions that I'm most interested in here are, what is the internet and where did it come from? And I ask the students this question on the very first day of class before we do anything else. What is the internet and where did it come from? So I just want to know their like non-expert thoughts about these questions. And invariably, every year, every semester, they give me the same two stories, and they give it to me in pieces. So they'll say something about, they've heard something about the military. Maybe they know the name ARPANET, or they say something about Silicon Valley. I've had no fewer than four students out of almost 200 just write Bill Gates, which I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but it gives you a sense that they're thinking of the internet either as the product of the American government, like a US government research project, or from Silicon Valley, some kind of venture backed corporate project. And these two stories have gelled into a collection of narratives that the sociologist Tom Streeter now calls the standard folklore of the internet, which is to say, this is kind of an accepted timeline of how events happened that is based in a very American view of the internet, but is also assumed to be a global story. And it generally follows that there was some experimental research network sponsored by the Advanced Military Research Projects in the 1960s and 70s. It was taken up by Silicon Valley and commercialized in the 1980s and 90s, and then became something that we would recognize today as the web or social media. So that's kind of the standard folklore. What's really strange about this when we look at across media history is that, unlike most histories, the internet arrived to the homes of users as something that was simultaneously new and old. So most of the time we see new technologies and everybody agrees they're new. And then we, at some point start to learn their history. But the strangest thing about the internet is history books about where the internet came from were published before most people ever knew what the internet was. So the history got to them before the actual technology did. It came as old and new at the same time. So here are two books that are clearly historical books about the production and creation of the early internet, published in 1995 and 1996 in English. And at the same time, one of the very first surveys of people in the US using computers indicated that virtually no one was going online in 1995. So here you can see these statistics show that of American households, those who identified as using computers at all were fewer than one third. And then those who had ever used email or the web is fewer than 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. And yet there are books on the shelves of the bookstore and the library about the history of the internet. So there's something strange happening. So a way to think about that is this standard folklore arrived at a time before the internet had been shaped. So the social construction of the internet had not yet happened, but the histories were already starting to be written. So that's a historical problem for us as we dive into this. So I kind of have been thinking about this as our project here is that we need alternative origin stories for the internet. It's not that the stories in the standard folklore are wrong or we're not correcting them. We're in fact growing them. We're adding to them by adding complementary stories that make it more nuanced or give it more explanatory power. So in some of my earlier work, I looked at origins of the internet in France. And in that context, we have this platform known as Minitel, which is a very different political, economic, as well as, excuse me, technological project from the internet in the US. And but I also really took inspiration from a more recent book by Joy Rankin, which is A People's History of Computing in the United States, where she says, yes, it's important for us to look transnationally, to look beyond the United States, but also within the United States, there are many histories that have yet to be recorded. She uses metaphors from computing technology to talk about this. And she says, let us overwrite the Silicon Valley mythology, looking beyond what she had critiqued as digital founding fathers to recover the many people's histories of computing. And so, what I want to present to you today is a piece of research that attempts to meet what Joy Rankin is asking us to do here, which is to see the history of computing as something that is bottom up, that comes from users, that comes from the experiences of computer owners and everyday people, and comes from many places at once. And so the standard folklore won't be located in Silicon Valley or like one particular place, but rather as many places coming together, which in a way is a historical narrative that looks more like the architecture of the internet itself. It's a decentralized history. So my suggestion is that we might look at dial-up bulletin board systems, which are generally called BBSs. And this is a photograph of a current day hobbyist's home bulletin board system. But it is a good representation of what bulletin board systems looked like for much of the 1980s and 1990s. That is, they're improvised, stuck in the corner of someone's bedroom, maybe in a closet or a basement. They are built using consumer technologies, and they are rather humble in a sense. They're not like very high tech, impressive things that like you might see a supercomputer center or a data center. Rather, it's something that is an extension of an existing hobby or interest. So I'm going to give this story to you in 4 parts, and the 4 parts focus on what came just before this period, like what were hobbyists and amateurs in North America doing around communications and telecommunications previously. Then what happens when these computer networks leave the world of technology enthusiasts and hobbyists and go to other groups of people? And then how does this square with how we understand the internet? Like, can we describe bulletin board systems as internets, or are they something different from that? And then lastly, we can look at what happens in the mid 1990s as the internet in the US is open to commercial activity. And there are parallel activities happening in Southeast Asia, in Western Europe. And we see a convergence of networks. Like, what happens to all of these little hobbyist systems? So I'll start with part one. And then at each of these stages, that's when I'll stop and I'll check the chat. So if you have questions, you can pop them in there. Okay, part one. What was happening before? So this is a revision of a North American story. And I say North America because this story bleeds across borders a little bit. So you'll see momentarily how this includes Canada, parts of Mexico, parts of the Caribbean islands. And in the 1970s, communication technologies were a big part of popular culture. And a piece of that is that the United States had reached a saturation point on telephone connections, which meant if you rented a new apartment or you moved into a new house, you could be reasonably sure there would be a telephone line already installed. You didn't have to go and get one installed. And that wasn't true in most parts of Western Europe at the time. For example, in France, it might be 3 months or more for a telephone line to get installed. And that was considered very bad. Um, but in the US, we are reaching like 95% penetration of telephone networks. And that was a big public achievement of the mid 20th centuries. But at the same time, in more of like enjoyable, like fun places, people were playing with communication technology. So in the middle of this slide, I have a poster for a movie called Smokey and the Bandit, which was a summer blockbuster. It's a action comedy about these two guys who are trying to drive a truck full of beer between two states. One state which does not sell beer on Sundays, and the other state where they're having a party. And it's a the whole movie is a chase scene with cops chasing the truck drivers, and much of the dialogue takes place over CB radios, which are mobile radios inside of the car. And this followed on a big fad of people installing two-way radios into their cars. And this was the first time that there was a DIY, like homebrew grassroots communication network that was accessible to anybody, that you could go to the store and buy a little box, install it in your car, and join this anonymous social network that was roaming around the cities inside of people's cars. And then the last piece of this, the third image you see here, is a magazine advertising hobby computers, kind of like this computer that's behind me here. And these are computers that you can build from a kit. And so for a certain type of technical enthusiasts, most of whom were young men, the computer was seen as an especially challenging technological project, that you could buy this kit and over the space of weeks or months, build a computer of your own. Now, what we're looking at is what happens when all three of these conditions come together: the universal access to the telephone network, the popular culture, interest, in communication, and the accessibility of hobby computers. And it looks like this project called CBBS that was started by two friends and enthusiasts in early 1978 in the city of Chicago. And Chicago is known for being cold. It's in the northern part of the Midwest in the US. And that year, 1978, was extremely cold. It was a year of blizzards and snow all across the Midwest and the northeast of the US. So there was just like one snowstorm after another. And this project started when the two men couldn't go to work. There was so much snow, they were stuck at home. So they called each other on the phone, and it resulted in building this computer that you see here, which is labeled CBBS. And CBBS stands for Computerized Bulletin Board. And so the bulletin board refers to what you can see on the side here, which is the standard community piece of cork where you pin messages that you would see at a university, at a church, at a grocery store, in public places where you can post messages. So their idea was, we'll make an electronic version of this and put it out on the telephone network. So this is not a screenshot, but it's a printout of what that network looked like. And it's a printout because many of the people using the network were not using video terminals yet, but paper-based terminals like the one that you see here. And these were produced widely in the United States and purchased by the military. And by the 1970s, they were available secondhand. So a lot of computer enthusiasts and also amateur radio operators had access to these teletype terminals. So one person at a time could dial into CBBS, read the messages that were there, or leave a message of their own. And it started as a place for the members of their local Chicago area computer club to join in, but then spread nationwide. And over the life of the system, which was just over 10 years, they recorded 250,000 callers on their one phone line. So that's one person at a time could access the network, and they had to take turns. One reason CBBS became so popular is that the two people, Ward and Randy, who created it, wrote a description of how the system worked in very great detail and published it in this popular computer magazine called Byte. And Byte is one of the only computer magazines in the US that had international circulation. So we know that Byte had readers who were reading the English language articles throughout Europe, including in Czechoslovakia and Poland. So it was a magazine that was circulating beyond just the North American hobbyist community. And as a result, thousands of other people imitated that system and created computerized bulletin boards of their own. And all of these bulletin boards have some common features. They're run by amateurs, mainly on a volunteer basis. There is private ownership over the hardware, so it's often purchased with money that somebody makes from their job. It's kind of an extension of their hobbies. And then it requires the existence of a public telephone network. So there's this balance of like public and private investment in making these networks happen. So from the time that they created that to about 1983, this is purely the domain of enthusiasts. It's just seen as a thing for techie people, mostly men, mostly younger men. And it's kind of like what we would think of as a boys' hobby. But after 1983, that starts to change. So let me pop over to our little chat here in case I'm missing anything. Chat. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Keep me posted. I'm going to roll into part two. So now our timeline, we're moving into 1983. And in the US, this is seen as is remembered as a beginning of a personal computer boom, meaning like the industry starts to really expand and the cost of personal computers falls. And one reason for this is that now we're entering the second generation of commercially available computers that are not kits. You don't have to know how to solder them together. You can just buy them at the store. And they range in price quite widely. Some are sold at toy stores for kids because they kind of overlap with video game culture. And so you can buy a computer for a few $100s, or you can buy a computer for a few $1,000s. So there's like a wide range. What's interesting is all of those computers can host or access dial-up bulletin boards. So you can build a bulletin board system that's fully functional on a computer that's made for kids to play games with. And this all creates a lot of optimism and enthusiasm for telecommunications and telematics. And the people who are in the industry in the US are aware that elsewhere in the world, specifically France, there is a growing number of people accessing systems like Minitel. So they're thinking, well, if Minitel does okay in France, it's going to go crazy here in the US because we have free market capitalism and that always works better. Unfortunately, this boom doesn't really happen. Instead, it becomes kind of a subculture for real computer enthusiasts who want to explore the edges of what they can do with their computer. And one reason for this, that it doesn't quite boom, is because there is a technical barrier, which is computers of the time do not include networking hardware. It is an optional thing to purchase a modem, which is the interface between your computer and the telephone network. And relatively few people in the US purchase modems. So, whereas in France, for example, computers tended to come with a modem interface, or they could be connected to the Minitel. In the US, you could buy a very expensive computer and yet have no way to connect it to the telephone line. So this data that you can see here is showing a little bit of the lag of modem ownership compared to computer ownership. So even when a relatively large number of people own modems, it's not really until the mid 1990s that many of them have access to modems. So the result is that bulletin board systems do grow, but they grow mainly among enthusiasts who are especially interested in joining into these kinds of online communities. Now, what's striking is that among those computer owners who do get a modem by the early 1990s, calling a BBS is the most common activity. And actually, those early people who get modems, they turn out to really, really like them. So about a half of the people who own modems say they would really miss having access to those online networks once they have them. So it took a lot of struggle, and we can talk a little bit about the methodology here, but I estimate that there are over 100,000 bulletin board systems that operated in North America during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and that they reached at least 2.5 million people, which is no small number. So while we might think of this as a rather niche activity, it's quite large compared to much better known systems. So, for example, the commercial platform CompuServe that reached much of Europe and North America was boasting about having 500,000 members. And it seems that dial-up bulletin boards had 5 times as many members as that. So I encourage us to think about this period of 1983 to 1993 as a period of thousands of people building networks in parallel to one another, all autonomously from each other, who could change variables about how their networks worked. It was a period of experimentation, exploration, and cooperation. Now, the characteristics of these networks vary a lot, but they all really have a few common characteristics. They are places to trade files with other people. So those could be pirated software, that was quite common, but it could also be text files, instructions, programs, things for education, for health, and then also places to discuss things, to have group dialogue, to come together as a community around shared interests. So this is a thing that gives rise to new aesthetics, and you might recognize some of these, this kind of colorful, blocky, character-based artwork. This begins in the spaces of menus, and the interfaces are accessed by typing keys on your keyboard. But they grow into an art form of their own, which is still being practiced by retro computing enthusiasts, and it is kind of the outer limit of the text mode interface before lots of people adopt windowing interfaces characteristic of systems like Macintosh and Windows. It's also during this time that non-enthusiasts of computers come to computer networks. It's groups of people who are trying to find one another. They may be a minority population where they live and they're trying to find one another, or they have a very particular interest. So three that I highlight here are this pink ad in the back is for anime enthusiasts. That's Japanese animation, which was relatively hard to access from the United States in 1980s and 1990s. And computer networks were a place for fans to meet one another and trade video cassettes and other things. The photo of the woman at the bottom is part of a network of people who are scanning images, digital images into the computer and circulating them online, which was a relatively difficult thing to do. And then in the back is an ad for the Back Room, which was one of the most popular networks for gay and lesbian computer users. And in each of these cases, trading the digital images, which included pornography, fandom like anime, and in the use by gay, lesbian, and queer users, the computer network, like the technology itself, was secondary to the community. The network enabled them to do something that they couldn't do without it. And so they built on the experience of the amateurs to build a user culture. So you might go out and get a modem specifically to access a network like the Back Room. You didn't have the modem before you learned about the network. And indeed, the Back Room was advertised in gay newspapers as well as in computer newspapers. So it reaches multiple communities. Likewise, this ad for the anime BBS came from an anime magazine, not from a computer magazine. Okay, part 3. Yes, grassroots initiatives. Okay, cool. We're going to get to this question about city residents next, because our next piece is thinking about this idea of the internet. And most of these systems I'm describing now, they are their own little worlds. They're isolated from one another. So you call one and hang up, you call another one and hang up. Each of them are separated. And if this is about internet history, it has to be about a history of networks connecting to each other. And so question for me and for you is, could we imagine this as an internet of BBSs, a network of networks where the networks themselves are BBSs? And one way to imagine it is that users are the ones who connect BBSs to each other. So initially, bulletin board systems did not have direct connection. So for a file to move from one system to another, a user would have to dial into the first system, download the file, hang up, dial the second system, and upload the file there, and that would move the file. So users played an integral role in creating that network. But in the mid 1980s, there is a kind of alternative geography being created of computer networks that enabled a different kind of networking to take place. And this is where my history is very peculiar to the North American context, which is the telephone network that spans Canada, the US, parts of Mexico, and parts of the Caribbean is coordinated by a nonprofit organization, an administration called the North American Numbering Plan, or NANP. It's a very small office that just coordinates, it tries to predict where the population is moving and where new telephone numbers will be needed. So they're the ones who define the telephone numbers for North Americans. And the core structure there is known as the area code. And the area code is a sequence of 3 numbers. And you can see this map here. This is like roughly the region where I live. And each of those parts of the land are marked by different numbers because all of the people in there, their telephone numbers are prefixed by that area code. And in the 1980s, there was a shortage of telephone numbers. So there was a need to create new area codes. So these area codes are breaking up, and it causes a lot of cultural confusion and people being very angry. So, for example, this image that you see here, it's a little poorly reproduced, but this was on the cover of the New York Times. It was the cover story of the New York Times that they were going to split New York City into 2 area codes. And it was a huge controversy that unfolded over more than a year of people saying, this is racist, this is classism, this is going to separate society so that the people from Manhattan will no longer speak on the telephone to people from Brooklyn. Like neighbors will be separated because they will no longer call each other on the phone. And it wasn't wrong. These sound like crazy to us now, but these were reasonable concerns because to make a telephone call within your area code was free. You didn't pay to make a phone call of your nearby numbers. But if you dialed outside of your area code, then you got charged a fee. And that's pretty unusual to the North American network that you paid a flat rate per month for unlimited calls locally. But then they start charging your minutes when you go beyond your area code. So if they split your city into 2 area codes, it costs money to call people in the other area codes. So businesses complained because they said, half of my customers will not call me. Or families complained because they said, my cousin lives in the other borough and I won't call him anymore. So these economic structures and had social consequences to them. So let's layer that into our bulletin board system network. And this is what happens is we have bulletin board system connections where users will only call networks that are in their local area. They won't call the faraway networks because they don't want to pay for it. And so initially that creates a sense of shared identity. So computer owners start to identify with those 3 digits of their number. So here's an ad for a BBS in Chicago. It says the world of 786. That's their area code. The way you learn about BBSs is organized by area code. So here's a list of BBSs that are all in 201. And the solution to this from the BBS point of view was, how do we create a network that will reduce the cost so that we can have communication across these borders, but not all of us are paying for it? And the result was to adopt a store and forward model where certain BBSs in the network will batch up the messages and send them in one bundle to a nearby bulletin board. So it doesn't bring the cost to 0, but it brings the cost as low as possible. So the goal, from a user perspective, cost is everything. Researchers who are funded by the government don't think about costs the same way that users do. Businesses don't think about cost the way users do because users are paying out of their pocket. It's the same pocket that they use to pay rent and buy food and things like that. So they have to think about costs in a different way. The results are really, really interesting because now bulletin board systems have certain messages or areas that are only local. So only local users see them. And some might go to a small network, and some might go to a larger network. So now there is this sense within bulletin board systems of, am I on my local system? Am I on a national network? Am I on an international network? And users start to develop a new way of imagining themselves online. So the creators of the original creation of FidoNet began from Tom Jennings, who wrote a bulletin board called Fido, and a friend, John Medill, who he was collaborating with. And he explicitly talks about it as something that started for fun, like, let's see if this is possible. And then it developed into something useful. So in the North American history of FidoNet, it starts as almost like a toy, like we're going to play and see what happens with playing. And then it later becomes useful. So the utility is reflected in the growth of the network. And for this period I'm talking about, the growth is quite dramatic. So by early 1990s, there are over 20,000 nodes in the network. And the network is identifying itself as worldwide or international. Here you can see an ASCII advertisement for a node that was in South Africa, which was considered very controversial for the time because many of the North American BBS users were opposed to apartheid, which is the anti-Black racist regime that prevailed in South Africa of the period. Okay, so here we're entering our fourth piece. What happens when the internet is added to this soup? We've got this period. There's clearly thousands of networks growing. They're starting to interconnect with each other. They're starting to grow international connections. And now in the United States, this research network is going to be opened up. And we know, like from our historical data, that this early 90s period is the peak of bulletin board systems in North America. So this is a graph of bulletin board system numbers that are on the North American numbering plan, and you can see a steep decline. This peak is around 94, 95. And consistently in my interviews with people, they also tell me, oh, it ended in 1995. So in their view, the American perspective, BBS is over in 1995 or 1996. Of course, we'll see more complicated than that. But it happens at the same time as the idea of the internet, the idea of cyberspace spreads it beyond enthusiasts and into general popular culture. So these are three magazines. Newsweek, that you can see here that has former President Bill Clinton on it. That's a massive magazine. Like you would see it in the checkout line of the grocery store or at any newsstand. The middle magazine, Popular Mechanics, is also a very widely accessible magazine. So people are reading those magazines who don't care that much about computers. They're like general interest magazines, and they're covering information superhighway, internet, World Wide Web. These terms are starting to enter the public dialogue. In this context, the bulletin board system users see themselves as the vanguard. Like they will be the ones to exploit the new internet. And for example, this is some quotes from a person who was writing about the internet from a BBS perspective in 1995. And he says that the web is boring. He's like, if you've been using BBSs, you're not going to like the web because there's no people there. It's boring. It's like not interactive. There are no games. There's nobody to talk to. He says that the web and the internet will only be interesting once all the BBS people come onto the web. And he says after that, the web will be enriched and changed. It will no longer be a publication platform. It will be a social network of a kind. So the interesting thing is the cost of that is we forget the BBS. The people who are on the BBSs come to the web, they make it social, but the term BBS itself vanishes from our dialogue. So the United States Census after 1997 no longer asks people about BBSs. They changed the survey so that the question asks about internet, not BBS. Likewise, some BBS operators no longer use the term themselves. Instead, they call themselves Internet Service Providers, ISPs. And you can trace this, and I have traced this in a number of cases, where the exact same telephone number that in 1993 would connect to a BBS, in 1996, it connects to an ISP. So they have not changed anything. They are same computers, same servers, same modems, same telephone numbers, but they change the words that they use. They describe themselves as internet instead of as BBS. So it's not that the internet replaces the BBS. The BBS becomes the internet. It is completely reinvented as internet in order to persist into the future. And we can talk a little bit more because it's slightly more complicated why that happened. But you can see in these two images here, these are advertisements for a period around 94 where some BBSs offer both BBS and internet services. So this one, surf the net on a better board. The idea was you dial into the BBS and then from there connect to the internet. The BBS is your portal or your gateway into the internet. It's really, really hard to know how common this was. So there are, I have found claims ranging from 30% to 95%. So the answer is somewhere between 30% and 95%, which I think is a lot of error if we're thinking about statistics. But we have some concrete examples of this happening. So here's where I want to go into our discussion, which is to think about the future of the internet in terms of BBSs. So I've asked us to think about this as a period of distributed experimentation. And I think of the experiments in three categories. One is in terms of the costs of entering and exiting a network. The second is about the potential for you to meet people, new people. And the third is about the control that operators have over their network. So I'll touch on each one because we can come back to them for discussion. So the first one, in the low barriers, in the case of the bulletin board system, the same computer you use to dial into a bulletin board can be used to host a bulletin board. That means you can really have in your mind, as a non-expert, an image of how this is working. Whereas in contrast to something like the cloud or Google or Alibaba, like these massive platforms, here you can go to a person's house and you can see the computer and point at it and say, oh, my data is here. My profile is here. My messages are on this box right here. And it looks like the box I have at my house. So for political activists, this is really desirable. And actually, this book, which is about anarchism and bulletin board systems, the author advocates to buy an older, cheaper computer because he says you can read the letters as clearly on a monochrome screen as on a color screen. You don't need images to talk to your fellow activists. Likewise, we've talked a little bit about how for queer users, gay and lesbian users, the opportunity to meet in an anonymous space run by someone who's sympathetic created a safe social place where there may not have been safe gathering places elsewhere in your town or in your city. The second piece is about meeting new people. And I mentioned a little bit when we were chatting before about the BBS named Echo in New York City, where the CISOP actively recruited women to be part of the network. So she would go to parties or art galleries, events in New York City that would have interesting, cool people at them. And if she met someone who was cool, she would give them a free account on the system and actually teach them how to get online because she wanted her system to be more diverse intellectually and socially. So she really had a hands-on way of bringing new users on board. It also is true, however, that there was no motivation, economic or otherwise, to restrict to let just anybody on. So bulletin board systems could be quite hostile to newcomers. You might have to know the person face to face before they let you online, things like that. Ask them for real information to join the board, or participate in an offline party or a get together. And there's lots of cases like the Win Plus BBS, which was a Christian BBS that would have a monthly pizza party. The Paradise Play BBS, which was more, I guess, X-rated, that would have trivia nights and go to bars. And then lastly, all of these point to something which I describe as autonomy, which is to say that the operators of the systems had a lot of control over them. So the TARDIS BBS in Indianapolis is a case that I've worked with at some extent. And the BBS operator, because of his personal experiences in his family, wanted to be sure that deaf and blind people could use the system. And so for that reason, he actually kept the software very, very simple in order to ensure that it was compatible with the computers that the deaf and blind users were using. So imagine like screen reader software, it wouldn't work well with flashy graphics. So he kept the software in very simple. And that goes kind of against this idea of unlimited technological progress, our assumption that newer is better. In this case, the older system was better for the goals of that particular system. That same system had an area that was open only to women, and you had to be personally acquainted with the moderators in order to get access to it. And the CISOP joked that he, to this day, never knew what happened on that. Even though the computer was in his house, he never himself had access. There was never access for him because he was not a woman to be able to access that system. So I'm going to add one more piece before we go to discussion. I know we're just about out of time, but this is something I added specifically for you because this is a puzzle that I'm working with, which is I started this project in part because I wanted to revise the North American folklore. I put a limit on that to look at North America. But once you start exploring this, you realize that that political boundary is very fuzzy. And actually, some of the story falls out if you try to stick too closely to that one geography. So for example, I found connections between the Minitel project and the BBS project where people built bulletin board systems that were accessible by Minitel. And in French, they refer to these as le microserver or server RTC. RTC is the acronym for a telephone network in France. And this is a screenshot of what that might have looked like. And here is what I'm most curious about now. is that actually the memory of FidoNet in Russian language social media is much more rich than in English language social media. A very simple experiment you can do is look at the histories of the Wikipedia page in English and the Wikipedia page in Russian for FidoNet. There's so much more detail on the Russian Wikipedia page and more participants editing the history of the page there. Likewise, for about 6 years, I've followed mentions of FidoNet both in the the Anglophone version and in the Cyrillic characters on Twitter and a couple other social media. And the Cyrillic characters come up much more often than the English name of FidoNet with FIDO. So looking back at some of the archival materials, there's only a little bit, and partly it's because my personal archive I'm working with is biased towards North America and English language artifacts. So here is a clipping from an article from 1989, Something Exotic, Polish Traffic in Echo Mail, which is the discussion forum of FidoNet. And so from that, I've started to build a rough timeline of FidoNet expanding into Eastern Europe and beyond its kind of North American context. And I should say this parallels dissertation research that researcher Bo An is doing at Yale University. He might be somebody to invite to a future seminar, but his research is about Chinese FidoNet or CFido. So that's another parallel story. So it seems to be that readers of Computer Magazine in Poland had arranged for a FidoNet connection between Poland and Netherlands in the late 1980s, and they connected at least 3 bulletin board systems. And then from there, they mention, but they don't detail, connections that went further beyond Poland. And they talk a little bit about problems with the telephone infrastructure and administration, but they say there is no restrictions on their access to modems. Then it seems that in 1991 and beyond, we saw on my data how the FidoNet and BBS activity declines quite sharply in North America. It seems that that is not the case outside of North America, and that there may be some more parallel growth, perhaps between RUNET and FidoNet, that is not as clear. Where the FidoNet internet comparison, it just seems like FidoNet activity moves onto internet networks and they gradually abandon FidoNet. In other contexts, there may be more of a hybrid approach happening. So these are puzzles. I have no answers for those. They are questions for discussion I thought you might find interesting. So that's kind of the summary of this research report. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to chatting more and hearing what you think. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. And you have a great presentation. It's very stylish. It's extremely important in our Zoom times.
Yes, I agree.
I think it's very cool. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand using Zoom button. And
Yeah.
I see we have the first question or comment from Sasha Isavnin.
Well, hello. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It's really cool stuff. And it's really interesting to hear it from somebody from that part of ocean. So it would be my comment or maybe partially answer to your question. As Leonie mentioned, in Soviet Union, there was really lack of telephone lines. Not the phone numbers and area code as something like exact phone lines.
Yeah.
And in many cases, there was so-called shared telephone lines when one line is used for more than one flat. So in this case, usage it for modem dialing will be very difficult, and especially it was used for very old central offices, which does not allow well work of modems. The second thing is really that there was a lack of hardware. Maybe it was even some schematics of home computers was published in related magazines. There was lack of microelectronics to build this. So it's black market, and something like was in Soviet Union exactly as for popular goods, that was also for electronics. So really few people have personal computers until fall of Soviet Union. So in 1991, maybe development of active community of personal computer, not IBM PCs, but any kind of personal computers like ZX Spectrums mostly, and its clones was started. And then actually internet comes. So again, in Russia, the peak of FIDO activity was, I think, 1995, 1996. But for me, for my experience, I never had FIDO experience because my modem was too slow to connect to local node, and I was not able to deal to the remote nodes because Moscow telephone network was so analog. So any forms of modem connection outside of my district and my DEF code was not able. But I want to mention two things. First of all, you have not mentioned in your presentation that many BBSs was actually commercial BBSs, especially the ones which became ISPs. So they were collecting money for deal time from their users. And we actually also seen this on references to this on the screens or paper advertisements you're showing to us. That's a real thing. Which affects maybe development of BBSs into ISPs. But for Russia, actually, nearly the same way of development of local small ISPs when enthusiasts were connecting to each other or were sharing one connection to ISPs or even a modem using other network technologies like coaxial Ethernet or something like this. They were started beyond 1995 when a lot of cheaper equipment appears. And actually in Russia, it's called something like Boy Scout Telecom or Young Pioneer Telecom. So when young enthusiasts, or not very young enthusiasts, by using simple technologies, were building their own local networks, which further connects to the internet. And another fact may be funny if you read an article in Russian about FIDO, you may know that we still have FIDO enthusiasts, and even hypertextual and graphical FIDOnet was promoted to then President Dmitry Medvedev, I think. So that's really funny thing, but also the civil society activists still looks at such technologies, looks carefully, because maybe in case of state interference to the internet itself, we have to use the FIDO-like networks, so USCP networks, to deliver our messages to us. As far as I remember, still my Ukrainian friends in ISP have a deal-in number, Ukrainian deal-in number for us. So if we will have the internet disconnected by telephone network, not disconnected, we will be able to use deal-up to deal into Ukrainian network. So modern technologies are still in use, I think. Thank you very much. If you have, well, more specific questions, feel free, I think, ask me or other club members. And maybe if we have some experience, we'll definitely share. Thank you.
Great. These are really helpful perspectives. And let me say like a couple things about those, because I think you raised some interesting points that were beyond the scope of this presentation. One is that I'm very interested in commercialization broadly in telecoms, because on the internet side, particularly in the United States, there is a very crude way of thinking of commercialization, as though things are all commercial or not commercial. And in practice, the bulletin board system makes that very unclear. So some of the bulletin board systems that I showed the graphics of very explicitly commercial. They are registered as businesses with the state. They pay taxes. Their goal is to make profit, and that is a minority of the overall bulletin board system networks. However, in a history mode, that minority is the best documented because it created all of these artifacts. They have advertisements, they are registered with the state, they often have thousands of users instead of a dozen or smaller numbers of users. So the commercial systems are overrepresented in our archive. However, there's like this in between state. And I'm thinking of a particular case. So there's a store, and the store is a gaming store of traditional games. So imagine Dungeons and Dragons or military games. And they decide to have a BBS as part of the store. And the store is operated more like a club. So people who play games at the store pay a monthly fee. And when they make the BBS, they say, oh, if you are a member of the club, you automatically are registered on the BBS. And they put computer terminals inside the store. So you can come to the store and access the BBS. You don't have to own a computer yourself. Now, that's a commercial system, but it looks really different than an ISP. And it doesn't quite fit the categories we have for commercial, non-commercial, or online, offline. It's people are sitting in a room with each other on the BBS together. So I think the interesting thing about the commercialization of BBS is that there are so many different models for how commercialization might happen. And all of them are different from how Silicon Valley currently functions, which is most Silicon Valley social computing startups depend on speculative investment, and they don't actually make profit at all. In fact, in the US right now, for some entrepreneurs, profit is seen as a bad thing. It means you're not spending your money fast enough. So it's like there is a almost traditionalism to some of the ways that the bulletin board systems commercialize. And this idea that connects also to your observations about the cooperative networks in Russia of when internet connections are scarce, then people work together in order to gain access to them. And they end up improvising networks which have cost. And sometimes that cost is shared in an informal way. So you might say, well, I'll buy you a beer at the bar next time, and that will balance our account. Or maybe we just pool money every so often. And if you're short this month, I'll cover you. There's ways that an informal relationship can form that nevertheless involves trading money in order to pay for shared costs. So yeah, I think there could be a whole other project specifically documenting these different forms of commercialization that happen among these more informal, enthusiast, or amateur communities. Thanks so much for raising that.
And we have some Sasha, if you want to.
Well, in short, continue think about commercializing. Actually, the commercializing and possibility for development business landscape in United States was completely different that we had in Russia in 90s and even like we have Russia now. In Russia, we have a really, really hard regulatory domain. And that really affects in comparison to United States and other countries. So that's a question, that's an issue we have raised more and more related to internet, especially here in Russia. But as you mentioned, huge companies like, well, Silicon Valley giants who no longer permits innovations for their possible small competitors. So we have a bit different issues. Even we have our Yandex, we have Sberbank, we have Mail.ru, which are actually the same as Google for Silicon Valley. But we also have much harder regulation, and that's also a topic and maybe a comparison thing. So thank you very much. I think we could continue discussion and communication on this topic. Thanks.
Yes, I'll say one thing also, which is a third node in our comparison would be in the case of Minitel, the state encouraged a kind of market to form that was very peculiar because the platform took on the accounting task, which was the platform tracked payments. And so that if you wanted to form a commercial network on the Minitel platform, you didn't have to accept payments, which is a really difficult problem on an unsecure network. And so all of the bulletin board systems in North America had no way to accept electronic payment. So to pay was really, really hard. And yeah, my partner, Lana Swartz, is a researcher also who has a book about payment systems, which has been a big inspiration for me on attending to these problems. And so this is just an interesting side note, which is at the same time as some of this is happening in the US, there is a new product from the telephone company, which is a number it's supposed to be a number for commercial lines. So they're known here as 900 numbers because they're all in the area code 900, 900. And a 900 number, when you call it, it starts charging you immediately a lot of money, like multiple dollars per minute. So almost all 900 numbers by the 1990s are phone sex. They're just like pornography lines. But a handful of bulletin board system operators made a hack on the 900 number where you could call the 900 number and then hang up, and it would put credits on your account on the BBS, and then you would pay the phone company at the end of the month, and then a month later the phone company would pay the BBS. This very convoluted hack. But they had no way to accept credit cards, and they had no way. So either they would accept cash in person or a check in the mail. The payment problem is central, and the fact that the Minitel developed so much commercial success was because they could accept payments, and the government took that role. So you could imagine the regulation there going another way, which is like the regulation can stimulate the small scale commercial activity at the same time as regulation can also squash it, as we see, or lack of regulation.
So, and I see Dmitry Kokorin have a hand also.
Hi guys, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I just want to add just one small kind of point of discussion for this topic of commercialization. I think the 90s is the time then internet starts to grow, and all this kind of stuff is BBS and internet in Russia and in Soviet Union. And I think what the most important thing which happened with economical system in the country was privatization. And so we need to trace like kind of how it impacted these first businesses, because some of them were kind of more entrepreneurial and had roots in this cooperative kind of networks and so on. But some of them were kind of assets which were transferred mostly to insiders and so on and so forth. And some big telecoms grow from this branch. And so I think it could be kind of interesting to compare this kind of tracks and so on.
Yeah, I think the process of privatization is slow and messy, and we don't have very good histories detailing all of what you're describing, which is how it actually occurs in different organizations, from small informal cooperatives to very large institutions. And we do, in the case of telecoms, we see it in the US for state-sponsored telecoms that were broken up by antitrust activity, and then their public functions were privatized. That's like a clear transfer. But the second order consequences are harder to track. And so one thing I've noticed in the bulletin board system case is that the process of privatization of the telephone in the United States unfolded between like the early 1970s and the late 1990s with a few different regulatory changes. And it tracks with the rise and fall of the independent bulletin board system. It seems like there was a period of opening up and the privatization and deregulation, and it hit a like local optima, and the BBSs could flourish. But then there was too much deregulation, and it started to close again because monopolies were able to form and squash or purchase all of the smaller networks. So you can almost see it as rather than in an instant, a change that happens at one point in time, rather like a process that unfolds over time. And there's almost a curve where you can find where there's a balance that allows certain kinds of organizations to occur. It seems like that point would happen at different places under different political regimes, that privatization will take different forms.
I guess it's quite, in a way, it's quite the same, not the same, but in bits the same in Russia, because you have this kind of first growing pluralism, and then you will have this big fish, like, you know, and more like consolidation of the market in the hands of particular guys and insiders. But I guess it is a normal dynamics. But it is interesting. What we have is kind of period of growing pluralism and a lot of entrepreneurs and BBSs and internet and early internet and so on and so forth, and new companies and so on and so forth. And now we have quite the same kind of monopolized oligopoly market with both service providers and social networks and so on and so forth. So it is interesting to trace these dynamics and probably to compare countries from this point of view, I guess.
I see the analytical problem might be that the country is not a reliable unit of analysis anymore. And one reason would be because a firm like Google or an application like WeChat, those are transnational in their application. So from a user point of view, Google is accessible from many different places and under different political and economic regimes. Likewise, WeChat or Facebook will travel with users in their mobile phones as they go from place to place. Under non-pandemic conditions, people are going on planes and trains and they're going to different countries and different things. And whereas the wireline telephone network was literally stuck in the ground or on towers in particular places within political boundaries, the mobile broadband and VPNs and these things make it so that some of the nation is a trickier unit to use as your structure, because Google may operate very differently in one country than from another country.
Yet, but you know, genesis of economical actors kind of happens in particular economic settings, and particular economic settings and legislative frameworks are important for this point of view. Also, of course, Yandex very active in many other countries, and so there are also parallels from this point of view. But I guess it's interesting to see how privatization came, you know, to fruition in those countries. But okay, I need to shut up. So thank you.
So, and we have some replies in chat. So Kevin, so you may just read them, because we all see the chat, and probably it would be better for me not to read it for everyone.
Why don't you pick a question for me to answer from the chat, and I'll go in order, because I haven't been able to follow it.
Okay, so the first question was about. So it was my question about the macro view and the micro view on the history of BBS, and if we turn to the micro level of particular user groups in 1980s, will we see grassroots initiatives to promote BBS among, for example, city residents or locals in a concrete place?
Yeah, in part because of the area code dynamic and the cost of calling long distance. Most systems had a regional focus, but that doesn't mean they had a regional mission. They may have preferred to be, you know, trans-regional in their ambit. But there is actually some very well-documented experiments in building civil society networks that aimed at particular places. And so cases that I'm aware of include Santa Monica, California, Blacksburg, Virginia, Cleveland, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
These were cities where groups of people built a network that aimed to provide access to local groups. And in some cases, they were in cooperation with local government, because they had the ambition of there being electronic democracy, that you could have questionnaires or polls or debates or other things. The presidential general election in 1992, which aligns very well and is the first time that presidential candidates in the US talk about information superhighway. They don't use the term internet yet, because that was not a known term, but they talk about building an information superhighway. that had a third party candidate who was not Democrat or Republican, Ross Perot, and Perot was very wealthy, and his wealth came from the computer industry. So he arrived on the political scene as a tech person. He was like associated with technology, and he strongly advocated for direct democracy, and he had a lot of support from bulletin board system operators. So among the bulletin board system operators who leaned more in a conservative political direction, and that tended to be more in a libertarian direction, against regulation, very business oriented, many of them supported Ross Perot. And there was a network of bulletin board systems who, for the period of time that the election was going, had recast themselves as Perot information sites. Like, you could go to them and download files and things related to the Ross Perot campaign. And it paralleled some experimentation by the political campaign itself, which was actually mostly about fax machines. So the Perot campaign had a big fax-based campaign to send flyers to journalists and other places. And they were part of his platform was that there should be telematic surveys of American citizens. And he talked about having an electronic town hall. Now, this vision came before it was reasonable for that to happen. And in the period of the time, they used fax machines, but they also believed that cable TV would be the way of this happening. And cable TV, we now think of as like national or even global or satellite TV, but cable TV's origins in the United States were very local. And it was often groups of people who were too far from the broadcast towers to get a clear signal over the air, would build a wire network to distribute television locally. And then those networks developed their own programming and things like that. So the history of cable TV and the history of the bulletin board system networks are actually more alike in some ways than the history of internet and telephone networks. They both kind of emerge in this decentralized form, and then were taken up by political actors later who hope to see this kind of electronic democracy take place. I don't know, those are a few anecdotes related to this that don't necessarily answer your question directly.
And what was a ways to find the users for concrete BBS system? How do they promote themselves? Only in magazines, or?
So this is very anecdotal and highly idiosyncratic. So some systems exist inside of a club. So the club exists first, and then you make a BBS for the club. And often clubs had a newsletter. So some early BBSs were made to be archives of the newsletter. That was especially important in the late 1970s because documentation was so little. It was very hard to get technical information about microcomputers, and it sounds like it was hard everywhere because magazines were sometimes the only place. But if that magazine was no longer available, someone might tell you it's in the October issue of such and such magazine, but if you don't have the issue, you can't do anything. So people transcribed articles and put them on their bulletin boards. So that's like one way. So you have a pre-existing relationship that becomes a bulletin board system. But a story that I've heard multiple times, that I've heard enough for me to believe that it's fairly common, is that computer stores themselves had old-fashioned bulletin board, a non-electronic bulletin board on the wall, and would post numbers of bulletin boards. So one person says they went to the store and bought a modem, and the salesperson gave them a flyer with a few local numbers in them. And my experience indicates that once you are calling one system, you can get access to numbers for other systems from it. So a very common file to find on bulletin board systems are just lists of other bulletin board systems. So that the barrier is getting to that very first system. And one reason that there is so much homogeneity in the socioeconomic demographics of these systems, that they're predominantly men, they're predominantly white men, they're predominantly middle class, college educated. Not exclusively, but it's because the word of mouth is how the information spreads. So you are usually invited by another person So that could be the person at the store. It could be a friend that you know, or a colleague. And that stops the diffusion of awareness of BBSs into other communities, because in the United States there is a lot of segregation by class and by race, and so groups of Black Americans or Hispanic Americans may not have learned about them. But it's also reflected in the overrepresentation of gay, lesbian, and queer users in bulletin board systems, because awareness of bulletin board systems spread through those pre-existing social networks. So you might see ads for bulletin board systems at a nightclub as a way to extend the community into the online space. A source, this is just an archival kind of geek question, which is one of the most important sources for bulletin board systems in North America was the back page of a catalog called Computer Shopper. And it's not a magazine, it's just a catalog. And it's a catalog of other distributors of computer hardware and software. And they kept a list in the back of bulletin board systems. It is believed that this is one of the most comprehensive lists of bulletin board systems, but nobody saves catalogs. They are considered trash. So whereas we have a lot of old computer magazines, we actually don't have a comprehensive collection of Computer Shopper. And so this thing that if you interview people, they all remember it. It's everybody remembers this publication. It's a nationwide mail order catalog, but almost nobody kept any copies of it. So it's gone. They're not, the Internet Archive has very few. So we're speculating a lot about how people found out about bulletin board systems, but I think we have some good evidence of the ways that information flowed.
And the second question from the second my question, and from what source do you know about the user response about like my nephew was on the other side of the wire border? It's about a picture with a wire in the middle.
Yeah, these come from newspapers. So I tracked that debate through newspaper articles, and it, like I mentioned, the computer things were marginal and niche and very, very seldom mentioned in mainstream media. So I tracked through a archive of national television news, like almost zero mentions of computer networks in the 1980s on television, and in newspapers. But the telephone network is ubiquitous. And so the change to the telephone numbers was very, very controversial. And so in different cities and towns around the country, when they are going to change the telephone numbers, they would host a public event and invite comment from the community or answer questions. So someone from the telephone company will come to the local school, and people can come and ask them questions, and people would become enraged. They were so angry that their telephone number would change. And so reporters who go to there write stories and wrote quotes down of what people were saying at the meetings. My favorite of this is about a meeting that occurred in Houston, Texas. And Houston is a massive city in Texas. It's not only big in terms of population, it is geographically really, really spread out. It's a big Texas city. Like, people say everything in Texas is big and the cities are really big. So they were going to split Houston into multiple area codes. And they said it was because the demand for new phone numbers was so high. And one reason is that families were starting to get a second phone line. So we talked about how hard it was to get phone lines into Russia even after the fall of the Soviet Union. But in the US, they were trying to sell people on phone lines, trying to come up with reasons someone would need a second phone line. A modem is a good reason, but most people didn't have modems. So the advertisements for getting a second phone line were for teenagers. So it was aimed at adults, and it would say, aren't you tired of your teenagers using the phone all night and you can't get on the phone? Get them their own phone line, and then they can talk to their friends on the phone, and you can have the phone line free. So at this hearing, this guy stands up, and he's so angry, and he says to the telephone company representative, he's like, I'm a father, and I have teenage daughters. are you telling me that my teenage daughter's telephone is going to be a different area code from my telephone? And the people from the telephone company were like, yes, we'll still live in the same house. We're not moving her. It'll be a different numbers at the beginning of her number. But the cultural value of that number was so strong that people were really afraid that something bad would happen if their children had a different phone number from them.
It's a great story, and we see some culture in the story of networks here in this piece, even. So the next question from Alexander Proskorina. I wonder if communities would have developed if money and other economy issues were not this important. Would you stay local and would they stay local and hobby-like, or would they still develop and grow to the point we see now?
This is a good question, and it is a counterfactual that we can entertain. One thing about the scale of this phenomenon is that the hobby style networks keep going. So at the peak of bulletin boards, most of them are still very small. Most of them still have one phone line, and they may serve a group of 10 friends. They are hobby-based systems. And I think there is a way that you can project that into the future to look into social media systems of the 2000s and see how even within very large platforms, we create bulletin board system like structures inside of them. So for example, you may join Reddit, and there are subreddits that are niche, and they start to function kind of like small bulletin boards, or Facebook groups are like small systems, and then also chat systems. So if you use, I think you all use Telegram for the club, or like Discord, any of WhatsApp. There are these chat systems, and you can make small groups within them, and some of those do function in some ways like a bulletin board system. You have a personal relationship with the other people in it. It may be the case that that is a more enduring form of social computing than massive like global platforms, the way that we have seen them. I think the big difference in how I have squared this in my mind is about the autonomy piece, which is in the bulletin board system case, the system operators own it all the way down to the microchips. And in the case of a Facebook group or a subreddit or a Telegram, you own it down to a certain point, and then the platform owns it from there on. And so there's something interesting there. Although I really hesitate to be too romantic about the past. And partly it's because now many people have access to these networks that could never have used the bulletin board system. In as much as the bulletin board system had a low barrier, it was a low barrier relative to like university networks or military networks. It's still a very high barrier compared to like anything that you do on your mobile phone now. So I don't know that trade-off is worth making necessarily, but it is. And I saw someone else had a question. There might be something there of taking the BBS as like a form or a genre, and looking at how that genre is recreated in other systems that would come later.
And the extremely actual question from Misha Yakubov. Kevin, thank you for the presentation. I'd suggest you look into small scale social networks that share many characteristics with old style BBSs. In Russia, we have two of them. They called freefeed.net and makam.place. And the question from Misha, what BBS or SSSN offers that Facebook or Twitter doesn't? Or rather, we should compare BBS and a club-like closed group on Facebook. Things like absence of censorship and ads seem to be not enough incentive for people to emigrate from Facebook en masse. My view is that certain UX options promoting more sensible emotion and rational interactions can make the difference. So it's about the future. It's a question about the future.
Yeah, I wonder about this a lot. And a motivation that I've been thinking with, or like a conceptual tool for me, is that I keep thinking about, can people imagine an internet after Facebook? And you can replace Facebook with any big platform. Is there an internet after WeChat? Is there an internet after Yandex? Is there an internet after Google? Like these, or Amazon, these big platforms. And if there is, it will look like something of a hybrid of the BBS time and the platform time. It will be like a platform BBS. And I don't know what that means necessarily, but we have to be able to imagine it if it's going to come, if it's going to be possible. And I think when I look at the data of internet adoption, a majority of people who use broadband internet today have only begun to use it in the last 15 years. So their whole experience of going online is shaped by the platform era. They have no firsthand experience of an earlier web or BBSs or IRC or any of these other systems. And so for them, they don't have that memory to draw on to make a contrast with the current platforms. I think this is one thing I've noticed when I talk to people who grew up in France about the Minitel project, is that for them, the memory of Minitel is very powerful, and it's a memory that shapes their experiences of future networks. So they can always say, how is this the same or different from Minitel? Most internet users across the world do not have that memory of an earlier form. They only have this form. So in doing the historical work, the one motivation to do history in this mode is to come up with accessible stories about the past that people can then incorporate into how they think about the present and how they imagine the future. And I do think that there are community forms that persist within these different platforms, and I detect that there is some dissatisfaction with them. I don't know that we would ever see something like a mass migration off of Facebook and into something else, in the same way that people didn't stop using email. Like these media linger on in ways that are unpredictable, but even when they become old, they don't go away. I think what we might see instead is people building smaller groups that maybe are more ephemeral. So you have a event, a conference, or a party, and you make a group chat. And then when the party or the event is over, like the chat falls down in your window and you don't use it as often. And there's something about obscurity and small scale that is a defense against censorship. That censorship regimes have only it's resource intensive, and so they will censor things that are durable and lasting and large and things like that. Yeah, not to go continue back and forth, but like there was a lot of concern about censorship among bulletin board systems, and you may know the civil society organization Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF. And we think of EFF, and EFF describes itself as an internet freedom organization. However, they were founded to support bulletin board systems because federal law enforcement were cracking down on bulletin board systems in the late 1980s out of a fear of hackers. And this was misguided in lots of ways, but it did have consequences for the people who were using the bulletin boards, some of whom had to go to trial or were charged with crimes and had their computers taken away. So even the origin of the idea of internet freedom or anti-censorship activism is in the grassroots. It's in the BBSs more so than it is in the internet communities. So yeah, I think as for people who are inclined to attend a Zoom meeting like this, part of our goal is to make these histories available to others so that they can imagine the future differently. And it remains to be seen what those futures will look like.
But if we speak about reclaiming the BBS, what is the preferred scenario to think about alternative networks in technical sense, or to think about alternative UX experience, like private small social networks with its own rules and all over.
Let
Well,
me jump
in, please.
Jump in here a bit. This is Michael, who was actually who actually wrote these questions and remarks about these small scale social networks in our chat. You know, I now witness development of some small scale networks quite for a long time. I'd say more than 10 years now. And I see that you know, some they definitely keep going on as villages, I'd say, as small towns, and this structure, I mean, from the social standpoint of view, and this prevents them from growing bigger. Actually, you know, a newcomer to a village has a hard time making himself acquainted with people who are within it, and with all the customs and the implied habits and traditions and the stuff like that. So mainly this serves as a detergent. So they usually continue over the years as small scale social networks. But still, I witness the importance of some features that we don't have in platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Mostly not because, you know, they are technically complex, maybe rather on the contrary, but because Facebook and Twitter are singles. They are the platform, and they should be defined. They cannot, you know, combine, or at least they don't try for now, combine different UI UX approaches and experiences in one platform. At least not to extend beyond some limited configuration available through settings. One example that is looming in my mind is the structure of comments. That on Facebook, you have this two-level comment structure. It's I'd say it already much better than the early days of the web-based bulletin board systems that have this unlimited tree-like structure that tend to you know, split, to crumble the talk into the meandering and drying you know, streams, each of which were attended just by 2 or 3 people. But still, it on Facebook, it like you know, it makes like a very uncoordinated and kind of cacophonical experience to read the comments. So the small scale social networks I witness, they adopted the even more laconic approach to this, like you know, one thread comment structure to each post, which resulted in a quite focused and I'd say more often meaningful than not discussions around the topics that people bring up in the post themselves. So kind of paradox here is that you know, one thread comment structure is from the technical standpoint of view and even from UI standpoint of view, it's much simpler than, for example, the tree-like structure or the two-level structure that is adopted by Facebook. But still, it's not worse. I'd say it just brings us completely different phenomena, completely, or at least significantly different phenomena in terms of you know, style and sense of the discussions that took place on the service. Well, I can go in more details, but I think this is some exposition into the topic. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so getting back to the question, yeah. So the question is, yeah, if we can kind of trace something like this between this BBS and closed group clubs on Facebook and small scale social networks and things like this, you know, into the future. So just, you know, to imagine something that we may encounter in the future years. Yeah, thank you.
I think this is a good direction to go to compare the UI. In some ways, the attention to interface has been rather limited, I think, in internet history, in part because the interfaces themselves are ephemeral and difficult to reproduce. In that, so I've gone to some lengths to try to reproduce interfaces from early bulletin board systems, which requires emulators or like getting access to old computers. And what you find is that most of the systems are actually fairly unsophisticated in terms of their structure. So the very earliest computerized bulletin board system has no differentiated topic area or threads or even the notion of a reply that links together one message to another. Rather, it's just a list of messages. Often they're numbered. And because of limited space on the disk, they are deleted. So I know I looked at a few different pieces of software from the early 1980s that ran off of a floppy disk, and they would use the disk sectors to mark the location of the messages. And when they got to the last one, then they would just delete the first one for the next message, and it would be a round robin. So from a historian point of view, that's like a nightmare, but also from a user point of view, it's extremely confusing. Like you're reading a topic and there's two people, and then someone brings up a new topic, and then there's two messages, and then it goes back to the old topic. It's very hard to follow. However, I do think there's another component of the experience that is not even on the table for present day social media, and that's time. And the time component of BBSs is really important because you're not on simultaneously with other people. You have to wait for a reply. So like I post my message and then I hang up and I go away because it's not reasonable for me to expect a reply until enough time has passed for other people to call on and leave their replies. So you can have a flame war and an argument, and you can have trolling and all of the abuse that we see on social media. That is all present in the BBS. It's not a Eden. It's not like a utopia. But they take place over longer periods of time, and that time creates more opportunities for interruption. So if the system operator observes that there is a argument that's beginning to take place, they can intervene, or they can stop. They can force the two people to talk to each other. If they live in the same area, they may talk on the phone or even meet face to face. So there is something about time and location which are present in the bulletin board system case and absent from the social media case and are worth thinking about. One interesting feature on Discord, which is just another one of these like closed social platforms used by gamers, is that the moderators can slow down the rate of messages in a chat. So then if you're posting and you post a message, a timer starts and you can't post again until such and such time has passed. And that's to stop people from flooding the channel. It's like an old IRC tactic, but it reminds us that the social media logic, and that is to say the logic of platforms like Facebook, is to have maximum engagement of users at all times. So for Facebook to continue to attract venture capital and investment, they have to report quarterly the amount of time that their users spend on average looking at the app. So they don't want to delay your opportunity to post or to read new posts. They want to encourage you to get new posts all the time. So the timeline structure is meant to feel endless. It's like there's always new posts to look at, so you open the app constantly. Whereas bulletin board system users talk all the time about having like a habit, kind of like you dial in, you check your messages, you write your replies, and then you hang up and you don't use it again till the next day because there will not be any new messages to look at or new files or anything like that. So I think there's something that could be experimented with more in the future is having different temporality in the user interface, which is maybe this is a network that doesn't need to move super fast. Like maybe you could imagine, say, something as simple as Twitter, where a person only gets 10 tweets per week. And so you have to be judicious in how you use your 10 tweets or something like that. I mean, just like we haven't even really, there's so much taken for granted in the design of these systems that could be variables, and we don't even see them as variables yet. We take them for granted that people want to access systems 24 hours a day. I'm blanking on the name of this website right now, but there's a web magazine that's about ecology and technology based in Barcelona. Some of you may know it, where their server is run on a solar power generator. And they say if there's clouds in the sky, our server might go offline because our batteries will run out. And it's just accepted. It's just an error message that's like, you can't access the server right now. Come back when the sun is up and our power is back on. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, of course. Why is it my assumption that every server on the internet is available to me at all times of the day? Like, why not? And many bulletin board systems were part-time. In fact, the one I showed you of the anime, it says it's hours. It's 6 p.m. to 9 a.m. So the telephone line might be used by the family during the day, and then after dinner, it becomes the bulletin board system. It is a possibility that social media applications could work that way too, but we rarely see those kinds of temporal or spatial characteristics taken up. But I love this question. We could talk about this for 2 hours.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, the temporal aspect is really important. Kind of considered it from the side of the common, being in one place at one time more than, time slicing through the day. But anyway, yeah, I think we should pay some how should I call it in English? Not gratitude, but recognize that Facebook, at least I know about Facebook, goes to a certain extent, in moving in certain, I'd say, more human-like and human-sized directions than it was, for example, initial. It was a period in the Facebook history then it was flooded with, an excessive number of media snippets and links, and it was obviously a risk of becoming not a platform for discussions and talks and interactions between people, but rather just another huge media fire hose for for TV channels and websites and papers and such. But they just took drastic technical measures like down-rating, algorithmically down-rating the posts that were just sharing the outside material in favor of promoting the posts that were more or less original content. And so we see entirely different Facebook now than we saw it like 7 years ago, I'd say. So it's also, evoluting not only in some unhuman Kafkian direction that, can be perceived from time to time.
Yeah, there's a paper from Jan Fernbach, which is from mid 2000s. It's kind of before wide adoption of things like Facebook, but she was looking at online communities in the context of blogs, and she was saying at the time, our theory of online communities is based on message boards and forums and chat rooms and these, like, which she said were all group dialogue systems. and she noted that the move to platforms like LiveJournal changed the structure just slightly so that it was more like a profile has posts and then the posts have comments versus like a group meeting in a conference. And I think that distinction is like a little bit lost because we focus a lot on timelines, and the way you're characterizing these small scale communities helps us get back to that. And so, yeah, that paper by Fernback was really helpful for me because she talks a lot about like what structures promote group dialogue and which ones don't, and then how could that give rise to different community structures on top of it.
Yeah, great. Would you please share the reference or maybe the exact spelling name for us to, to look up? I mean, of the author of the paper. You're on mute, actually. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna get my references and I'll paste it in the chat in a moment. Okay. This is the one I'm thinking of here. And oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking of that one. And then also, this is a more recent one. Let's see. So this one from Laurie Kendall puts Fernback in a more present context because it's published after the rise of the social media system. So you sort of have, I kind of like read them together in how I was summarizing it just now, because obviously the Fernback one was in 2007, so it's probably written in 2006, and they just hadn't really seen the emergence of social media as we think of it now. They're talking about social network sites that look more like profile networks and don't have that commenting feature as much. But yeah, of course, these are moving targets. Like Facebook is not the same year to year, and it's easy to almost stereotype it as such.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin.
Mitya, you have a comment, I see.
I've got a small question, another one. You mentioned what one guy run the community, like bulletin board, with special rules for kind of women who accessed and so on and so forth. I just curious about rules. Actually, I wrote my MA thesis about rules in Russian Wikipedia, and I think what internal rules for communities are incredibly important. And are there any kind of archive of those kind of rules in these early communities and bulletin boards? And are there any kind of differences between those communities, which is significant?
This is a really good question because the autonomy that I'm describing, we think of it as technological because they control the hardware and software, but it's also social and political. And initially, there is not that much discussion of rules because there's so much focus on technology, and the communities using it are fairly homogeneous and tend to grow out of pre-existing relationships. But by the late 1980s, you see more interactions between strangers and more diversity in ideology as well as in identity. And so then it becomes necessary to have rules. And there's a number of metaphors of how to think about your bulletin board system. And one of the dominant metaphors is as a house party, which is that the computer itself is in someone's home. And so in a way, that person is inviting others to electronically into their home, and so therefore they should be able to be the arbiter and set the rules. and a number of books published in the early 1990s, which are how-to books, like for people who want to start a BBS. They have a chapter on making rules. And so I have a paper that I can share also that is a kind of a small first step at analyzing the variations within those. And some of them take a very legal frame. And so there's two lawyers who had a column in a bulletin board magazine that was about like law for bulletin board system operators. And it's all about liability and like who's responsible if someone uploads porn or pirated software or something like that. But actually, most of the rules, from what I can tell, are informal and they are reactions. So it's like something happens in the community and it's a problem and everybody recognizes that as a problem, and then a rule is created. I have not found very much evidence of like democratic rule making. Rather, most of the rule making is autocratic. That is, the system operator who controls the hardware and software also gets to have total control over the rules. But that being said, the rules can be pretty informal. So like some rules there are no rules. So there's a number of boards that are self-identified as like anything goes. And they will say like, I don't want to babysit this system. So you need to have a thick skin and not get upset and not be offended if someone says something, and just roll with the punches. And if you don't like it, leave. This isn't the place for you. And that's a pretty hostile stance that is not welcoming to new users. So that's a good example of like rules that maintain the status quo. But it seemed like there was efforts by others to make more formal rules, and some of those were connected to existing activist or civil society or even subculture affiliation where rules were necessary in those other spaces that carried over. So like the Well is one of the best documented and most well-known bulletin boards, and the Well is explicitly connected to the counterculture kind of hippie California community. So they have rules that reflect the values there and would be appreciated by the users drawn to the system. And one of their best known rules is you own your words. And that what's interesting is it creates this loop where there's like a technical situation that then enables a social rule, and then the rule is recast as a technical system. So the you own your words rule came from the fact that like users come and they type into the bulletin board, and the words or the messages are stored on the bulletin board. So it created a property problem, like just from a strictly legal point of view, like who owns this text that you have written. So they were saying, this is yours. And in time, that created a new technical feature, which was that any user could delete all their old messages. And that feature has some interesting consequences, because that meant if you went to track back an argument or an old topic, you might not be able to understand it anymore because the old users had deleted all their old messages. So that's a kind of interesting one, because it gave more power and control to the users at the expense of the community's own like self knowledge. So yeah, I'm interested in that. I also have been in touch with a researcher named Nathan Schneider, who studies these similar questions about the rule-making processes of social computing systems, and he reached out to me because of the BBS thing, and he helped me a little bit on writing that paper. So I don't have a recent publication from him on this specific topic, but I expect that he will publish something soon. And I'll type his name here.
Okay, great. Just one guess. I guess what depending on what kind of rules you have in the community, the performance of the community would be different. Like some set of rules could provide some kind of competitive edge for somebody. Like Wikipedia was very competitive and very successful because of the rules, how they engage community and how they perceive the context. Content. So I guess there are something to look about. Thank you for your reply. Yeah.
I mean, something I would say about the Wikipedia context, I'm curious to know what you think, is I think that Wikipedia editors, especially the kind who engage in dispute, are comfortable with rules. Like there is a individual appreciation for rules, rule making, administrative procedure. And so to be part of Wikipedia, you have to have some willingness to learn this very arcane, complicated system, and then you can be quite successful within it. I think with social systems, there are people who they are not willing to learn those rules, and so they cannot be part of that community. So having complicated rules at all can sometimes exclude people. A big contrast between Wikipedia, BBSs, and other commercial social media systems is that most commercial social media systems, they don't have rules in the way that a community would have rules, because they aren't communities, they're businesses. So they have terms of service, and the terms of service is not accessible to a human, and sometimes they're so long, like a person could never read them. And so I think of those as hostile to community ownership, that despite the advertising of many social media systems, I don't feel like I'm a member of the community, because that system has no accountability to me. If I'm not happy with the way that they run the platform, I can't appeal. There's not going to be like a hearing for me. There's no court. There's no judges or lawyers. There's no legal regime. There's just the terms of service. Like it or you don't like it, you leave it. And so I think in my 3 points about the future, based like a BBS future, one of them is about the barriers to entry and exit, because in the BBS case, the cost of leaving a BBS was lower. The cost of leaving Facebook is very high. For some people, that's the only way to communicate with members of their family. So their barriers they have low barriers to entry, but high barriers to exit. And I think it's important for us to attend to both entry and exit from these systems.
Sure.
So I think that we need to go to the end of our seminar, and I have the last, or probably pre-last question about data, because you wrote, Kevin, that the history of nets is about messy data which is not collected and not institutionalized. And probably you have a story from your research experience of your last research about such data, and how do you work with them? How do you deal with this complexity? And you need to turn on your mic, unmute.
And let's see if this
Yep.
works.
Uh-huh.
Okay, can you see the images again?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let me just get down here. So I have a bunch of images that I didn't show you, but included in them are some archival research records, if you will. So yeah, there have not been formal efforts to archive many of these systems, and there's two reasons for that. One is from the difficulty of saving these things, which is some stuff sticks around. So you can see in this picture here, there are boxes and there are screens and modems and things like that. But the messages themselves were often very ephemeral. They go away. But people's memories don't necessarily. So there have been various efforts over time to create spaces on the present day internet for former bulletin board system users to re-establish their relationships. So you can see in this image here, there's BBS mates and a couple others that were, they're databases of old BBSs that have comment systems where former users try to meet one another. The closest thing to a formal archive I use is textfiles.com. And that is a pretty massive effort by Jason Scott, who describes himself as an independent or archivist. And yet he also is overwhelmed by the material culture of the period. So I think of it as this paradox where there's too little on one hand and too much on the other. So this photo is one that I took from visiting at Jason's house, where he had a large collection of materials that were not organized. And we worked together for a week to extract all of the magazines and periodicals. And what had happened is that because Jason had made textfiles.com and later created a documentary film series about bulletin board systems, is that all of these people who had their own piles of stuff started to send it to him unsolicited. And so he had these growing mountains of things, and it was not possible to know what value was there because people were just sending it to him. So there is this burden that right now has been placed mostly on amateur collectors. And a kind of piece of this paradox is for professional or university researchers to pursue this research. It's essential to form mutually respectful relationships with amateur collectors and archivists and people like Jason who work independently. He is employed by the Internet Archive, but his work extends beyond that, where the incentives are different. So like for collectors who are collecting old computer stuff, sometimes it's nostalgia, but it's often value. So like Apple computer products are luxury goods and they are priced like luxury goods. So early Apple computer products for sale on the secondary market are very expensive. I was thinking of an experience recently where I attended a flea market that was for amateur radio enthusiasts, and I purchased a modem from someone, and the modem was like $5. And whenever I have that experience of buying something from someone, whether it's face to face or on eBay or online at auction, I try to always like stimulate some conversation afterwards to say, was this your modem or something, like see if there's a story around it. And once in a while there are. And in this case, what was so interesting is this person who I saw week after week at this event, because we both went to the same swap meet every week where enthusiasts trade old technology. He said, "Oh, you're interested in modems? I didn't know anybody cared about modems. I have tons of them at home. I just would never think to put them in my truck and drive them down here because I don't think anyone will buy them." So he was doing like an economic evaluation of the stuff in his home, trying to guess at what was valuable and not. And he was not able to anticipate that that would be valuable to me. So there's lots of materials that would be of interest to historians that are currently in boxes in people's homes. And it's difficult to move from that situation to a situation where they are preserved and accessible to researchers. Even when we scan periodicals, for example, and make PDFs of magazines, those are not discoverable by researchers. We may not find them. And this leads to biases like currently a lot of the materials that are available about early microcomputers are in English. And that reflects like a lot of other conditions that are not directly related, but do have continued to shape histories of technology over time. So for us to change those conditions, it requires like a lot of effort and resources. So I don't know if that's kind of the story that you're interested in, but yeah, I think I'm very curious about what things linger on and how do we recreate the past based on the sometimes fragmentary evidence that exists.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I should say also, can I say one more funny thing?
Yeah,
is when I talk to historians of like the 19th century or the 18th century, they are like not surprised by this. And in fact, they would look at these pictures and be like, you have plenty of evidence. What's the problem? or imagine an archaeologist who has like a fragment of a bone or something like that. I had, I'll tell you one quick story, which was I visited a museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is the city where Microsoft originally started and was the place where the Altair computer was formed. So it was almost Silicon Valley, but it did not happen. So their museum there is a natural history museum, and it has a computer history exhibit. And so I talked to the curator, and he said he had all these materials, so I was going to come and look at their collection. And in order to get to the computer stuff, you had to walk through a barn that was full of dinosaur bones. So like I had to sign in and wash my hands and do all this stuff. And then we walked through a huge facility that was all dinosaur bones. And then in the very back was one closet with no windows that had like 2 filing cabinets of computer things. But walking past all the bones was like a ritual in order to access the computer history.
Yeah, it's perfect, and it's so my question was definitely about it. So if somebody have a last question, we have a small window for it. If not, okay. Misha, you turn your microphone on, so I.
No. I was just going to thank Kevin once again for the very interesting presentation and a very interesting discussion afterwards. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, indeed, thank you very much for the seminar. You told a great story and the history, and it was very interesting to hear what the history of networks, of nets, looks like from a North American perspective, and to discover some similar things that we had in Russia and some differs. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your attention and your great questions. And please do reach out to me by email if you want to keep the conversation going, or if you have any trouble accessing those citations that I put in the chat.